Good morning. I'd like to welcome you to another edition of the Sunday School Review. This week's Sunday School lesson is entitled Lord of the Sabbath and is taken from Matthew, the 12th chapter, verses 1 through 8. And in this week's lesson, we are in the book of Matthew. Now, Matthew was a Jewish tax collector who became one of the 12. Now, the book of Matthew was, as I said, Matthew was a Jewish tax collector. I mean, he was a Jew, but Matthew was written primarily to the Jews. And when we go into the book of Matthew, it's going to start out, it starts out in chapter 1 of Matthew. It starts out talking about the genealogy of Jesus. And Matthew is showing us here that Jesus was a descendant of David and Abraham. And Matthew set out to prove that Jesus was the Messiah, as it was predicted in the Old Testament, that the Messiah would be a direct descendant of David and of Abraham. And that's what Matthew does in his very first the beginning of his gospel, is to set out to show how Jesus, the Messiah, has a right to the throne of David. Now, and this is where the rub came in the fact that the Pharisees and the religious leaders did not accept Jesus as the Messiah, because they was not expecting one. They was expecting a military type leader. Okay, so from day one, the Pharisees, the religious leaders, rejected Jesus, and as a result, they kept a close eye on him and his disciples, what they did. And any little thing, as we're going to see in today's lesson, where how the dispute arose, okay, versus keeping of the law, Mosaic law. And this is the dispute in the lesson, is Lord of the Sabbath, where Jesus and his disciples were criticized for violating the Sabbath law. That's the crust or the main thrust of this lesson. Okay, we have two outlines. The first outline is question of lawfulness. In other words, the Pharisees and religious leaders had a different interpretation of the Sabbath law. Okay, we're going to discuss that in our lesson. So they had a different interpretation. They interpret the Sabbath law differently than what Jesus did and what is going to be explained in this lesson. And that's why in this dialogue, they accuse the disciples, or I mean, since Jesus was the leader, let's say, they accuse Jesus, because basically they said, well, yeah, your disciples, so either you put them up to it or you acquiesce the whole thing. So we're going to accuse you of breaking the Sabbath law, violating the Sabbath law. Okay, like I said, there are two outlines, and the first one is question of lawfulness. Okay, that is the Sabbath law. And the second outline, and that goes, first outline goes from actually, it's just 1 and 2, really, 1 and 2, verses 1 and 2. So the second outline is what is greater. And that takes us through the rest of the lesson from verses 3 through 8 of Matthew. What is greater? Second outline. Okay, let's go back to our first outline, a question of lawfulness. And we're going to read 1 and 2. Verse 1 said, at the time Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were an hungered. That's important. Disciples were an hungered and began to pluck the ears of corn and eat it. Okay, so that's what they did. We're gonna come back and discuss that. Verse 2, and when the Pharisees saw this, like I said, they were there, there was Jesus' worst critics in that time. The Pharisees saw it, they said unto him, unto Jesus, behold, thy disciples do what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath day. Basically, you're doing an unlawful deed, an unlawful thing on the Sabbath day. So there was a Sabbath rule, a Sabbath law, okay? And we're going to talk about this here. Now, as I said, there was a major disagreement about that. Now, we're going to go to Luke. First, we're going to do Luke first. That is Luke, the 13th chapter, and we're going to read verse 11. We're going to look at verses 11 through 17 or 18. Okay. And verse 11 of Luke says, and behold, there was a certain woman which had a spirit of infirmity 18 years, and was bowed together, and could in no wise lift up herself. Okay. So this woman was in had a serious physical condition. Okay. And when Jesus saw her, this is verse 12, he called unto her and said unto her, woman, thou art loosed from thine infirmity. And he laid his hand on her, and immediately she was made straight and glorified God. That's verse 13. Verse 14 said, the rulers of the synagogue answered with indignation, because that Jesus had healed on the Sabbath day, and said unto her, and said unto people, there are 6 days in which man ought to work, and them therefore come and be healed, and not on the Sabbath day. This is what they said. Okay, you got 6 days, but don't do it on the Sabbath day. Okay. The Lord answered him and said, thou hypocrite. Now, here's where Jesus called them out. He called them out here. He called them out on the carpet. He said, ye hypocrite, do ye not each one of you on the Sabbath loosen his ox or his ass from the stall and lead him away to watering? And ought not this woman, being a daughter of Abraham, whom Satan has bound, lo, these 18 years, be loosed from this bound on the Sabbath day? Okay, here's the issue here. We have this tradition, this religious tradition, okay, and that says don't heal on the Sabbath, okay, don't do any work on the Sabbath. That was good. Don't do any work on the Sabbath. And they construe that as work. Okay, we're not going to debate that, but they construed his healing on the Sabbath as work, and thus a violation of the law. But he called them out seriously. Well, you have exceptions here. He said, you hypocrite, you have exceptions. Okay, and verse 15 said it. Do you not each have on the Sabbath loose his ox from the stall and lead him away to watering? Now, you're taking care of needs that can satisfy, job needs. But we have this woman now, 18 years. If you think about a baby that's born and 18 years later, for all practical purpose, they are an adult. 18 years in our society, you're considered an adult. Now, you haven't reached the age of majority, which is 21 in most jurisdictions, but you, for all practical reasons, the criminal and all that, you considered an adult. So all of your adult life, this woman had an infirmity, and you're gonna quibble over the fact that this is a human being, this is a human soul that was relieved of her illness on the Sabbath, and you're gonna complain when you can go and get your donkey out of a ditch and help your donkey, and you're gonna complain that a human. Where's your compassion? Where's your mercy? Where's your mercy? Where's your compassion? You've got more mercy and more compassion on a donkey than you have over a human that have been had infirmity for all of their for nearly an adult life, 18 years, and you complain. Now we already talked about it. The reason that they were so critical of Jesus and his disciples was that they rejected him, and they followed him and find any fault that they could find. Now, and Jesus, he called him a hypocrite because you make exceptions for a donkey, but you don't have the mercy and the compassion to make an exception for a human. Are you serious? Okay, and that shows their hypocrisy right there. They got more sympathy, more compassion on a donkey than they do on a human person, a person that, and nonetheless, that have been suffering for 18 years. That's a long time. Okay, so he and Luke, he calls them out on their hypocrisy, and we can see that clearly. We can see that clear as day. That no compassion. Okay, and they're worried about some ceremonial law over a human soul. The ceremonial law, in their opinion, is worth more. And we're gonna talk more about that. Okay. So they was moved with indignation when Jesus healed. Jesus showed compassion and healed a human on the Sabbath day. Okay, and he told him basically, you don't practice what you preach. You don't practice what you preach. Now, okay, now we're gonna go to the law, which is Deuteronomy. We're gonna go to the specific law that they allege that the disciples broke. We're gonna read that from Deuteronomy, and it's Deuteronomy, the 23rd chapter, and it's verses 24 and 25. Now, we talked about, we read what they said in verse 1. The disciples, they were hungry. I said that's important. They were hungry. They wasn't out just pleasure seeking, they were hungry. And they plucked an ear of corn. The Pharisees said, you broke the law. Let's go back to Deuteronomy and read that specific law. I said it's 23 and verse 24 and 25. We're going to read 24. And when thou comest into thy neighbor's vineyard, this is 24, then thou mayest eat grapes till filled at the time at thine own pleasure, but thou shalt not put any in thy vessel. Okay, let's read 25, and then we can talk about both of them. When thou's coming into standing corn of thy neighbor, this is what they did. Thou mayest, it says mayest, thou mayest pluck the ears with thine hand. Listen, with thine hand, but thou shalt not move a sickle unto thy neighbor standing corn. Now, I've never seen a sickle in real life. I've seen pictures of that. That's like some type of curved blade that you use to harvest grain. It's a knife-like thing that you use to harvest grain. So verse 25 of Deuteronomy 23 says, it is allowable that they can pluck, and I'll read it again, thou mayest pluck the ears with thine hand, but thou shalt not move a sickle unto thy neighbor standing corn, which means you cannot go in there with a sickle and harvest your neighbor's corn, but you are allowed to pluck some if you are hungry, you need in need. That was a requirement. And let's look at what they did again. We're not going to dwell on it much, but longer, but we're going to look at it again. His disciples were hungered. They were hungry. That's clear. I can read that. It says hungered. And began to pluck the ears of corn and eat. Deuteronomy says clearly again, thou may pluck the corn with thy hand. It did not say they had a sickle and they were harvesting corn. So that's not really what they were doing. But when the Pharisees misrepresented the action, they basically slanted the story to say they were harvesting corn in their neighbor's field. No, they were not. The law provided an exception. Here's the rub again. The Pharisees took the law and they added their own rules. I'll repeat that again. They added their own rules and they elevated their own rules to have the same weight as God's instructions. Let me give you an example here. In the Internal Revenue Code, they have statutes. The Internal Revenue Code statute reads thus and so. Then they have the Internal Revenue Code regulations. The regulations are to explain the statute, not change the statute, give more understanding to the statute. So what the Pharisees were doing, they were said, we have the law, but we're going to add to the law, and then in addition to add to the law, we're going to give our additions more, just as much weight as the original law. That's where they were wrong. That's where the law was not meant to be a burden. And that's exactly what they were doing. That's why Jesus called them a hypocrite. Because we have the law, and we're going to cover some more about the law later on in the next outline, but we have the law. The Mosaic law, that's good. Here's the law, what it said. But then they came and said, well, we're going to add rules. We're going to put our exceptions to it. And then we're going to raise our exceptions to the level of the original law. And that's why they were wrong. So they was wrong in the sense that saying that the disciples violated the law. They did not violate the law. They was allowed to pluck with their hands and eat because we said it. They were hungry. They didn't do anything wrong. They was not harvesting. And we read back in the Deuteronomy, it said, don't take a sickle to it, meaning harvest. When you take a sickle to the grain, you cutting it down, you harvesting it. Okay, that's what it says. And just like 24 said, you can eat of the grapes, but you can't put it in a vessel. You can't harvest it. That's basically what it's saying. An emergency situation, and tell me this, if you hungry and there were grain in the field which were accepted, which you were allowed to eat, and you ate it, where is the violation? There is none. But they interpret it as a violation, and that's why Jesus called him out as a hypocrite. You have exceptions, and you make exceptions for a donkey, but you don't have any compassion or mercy on a human. You're a hypocrite. You don't practice what you preach. Okay, let's go to the second outline. Okay, the second outline said, what is greater? And this is really the nuts of the whole lesson. Which is greater? A human soul, having compassion on a human soul, than obeying the legalese of the law? Which is greater? Okay, and let's go into it. Verse 3, and this is another exception here. Okay, but he said unto them, this is Jesus, he said unto him, have ye not read what David did? David was the king. What David did when he was hungry. Again, when he was hungry, and they that were with him, his men. Okay, let's go to 4. How he entered into the house of God, he did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them that were with him. Okay, but only for the priest. Showbread was only for the priest. Okay, and another case in verse 5. Or have you not read in the law? Okay, how that on the Sabbath day the priests in the temple profaned the Sabbath. Okay, and are blameless. Okay, in other words, he said, well, they violated the Sabbath and they were blameless. In other words, they did what you would say is tantamount to work. Okay, but okay, let's read 6. But I say unto you that in this place one is greater than the temple. We're gonna come back and discuss that a little bit more. But let's talk about 5 right quick. Okay, so the thing is, the priest was commanded, or was given a command to carry out the services in the temple. He was given the command basically to do work. This was allowed. Okay, so he was given the priest, if you want to say technically work. Okay, and there was law that said, well, you can't do any work, but God commanded, okay, for this to be done, even on the Sabbath. So we talking about what is greater, okay, and we go back to the first outline is about the law was obeying requirements of the law. Those were requirements or a restriction. And so we have that obeying strict requirements of the law versus human needs. That is mercy and compassion. Okay, and we gotta and we might as well I guess read it now. Is Hosea, and it's the 6th chapter of Hosea. We might as well get that in right now. So Hosea 6:6, and it says here, "For I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offering." So what it's saying is that mercy trumps these legalistic rituals, these requirements. And secondly, they are to benefit humanity, rather than to be a burden. And that is the thing that Jesus criticized the Pharisees and the religious leaders so hard, because by adding these other requirements to the law, they put burdens on the people. That was the rub. They put burdens on the people. So it was the law was not meant to burden the people, but that's exactly what they were doing. They were creating more burden. The law or Christ came to bring mercy, to relieve the burdens, not to burden the people. So mercy, human needs trump or overrides, okay, ceremonial laws. So the laws, the Mosaic law was ceremonial. Now, if the law is not to benefit, if the law is to put burdens, that's what Jesus is against, using the law to burden the people, because after all, these are ceremonial restrictions. Okay. And just like even today, I know we know that out there worship is Sunday, which, like I said, is not the Sabbath day, is Sunday. And some people may say, well, I don't want to work on Sunday. I don't want to work on Sunday. But nowadays, now you go years back, it was an agricultural society, and they had tractors. They probably didn't have lights on and things like that. You couldn't work at night. But now even they got tractors. You can farm at night now, because they got farm machinery that lights up, and you can farm probably 24 hours a day. Okay, but the idea is that we have ceremonial restrictions, and that's what the law was. The law was ceremonial restrictions, and Jesus came when he healed this woman that had this infirmity for 18 years. He's raising the issue that her needs, human needs, trump ceremonial requirements or restrictions. Okay, what is it more beneficial to, for example, even today? And we know hospitals and police departments, fire departments are open 24/7, 365, right? What about you go to the hospital? Well, you have a bad accident, a bad wreck, and the organs are hanging out. So you take a person to the hospital. Well, we're not working today. Sit down, rest. We're gonna take. You gotta wait till tomorrow. We got a human life here at stake, and you mean these ceremonial rules is gonna trump human life? This is what we just read in Hosea 6:6. For I desire mercy, okay, mercy, and not sacrifice. That's and knowledge of God more than burnt offering, ceremonial. So that's the difference between, and why there was so much conflict between Jesus, the Pharisees, and the religious leaders, because they held the ceremonial laws much higher than compassion, mercy, and human needs. As I said, they had the needs of a donkey higher than this human need. They criticizing Jesus for healing this person that was sick for 18 years, but yet they approved getting a donkey out of a ditch. on the Sabbath. Hypocrite. Jesus was right. He called them out. Hypocrite. You're a hypocrite for doing that. Okay. And we're talking about, we go back to the outline of what is greater. Basically, and to really answer the question, okay, what is greater? Mercy, compassion, human needs are ceremonial laws. Which is greater? Which is greater? So the Pharisees and the religious leaders did not understand the real purpose of the Sabbath. They didn't understand the real purpose. The real purpose, and really in the end, I don't think we read that scripture yet. No, we didn't read that scripture because we hadn't finished all the verses in the lesson. But I'll read that scripture here, where the fact that, I think it's verse 8, for the Son of Man is even Lord of the Lord of the Sabbath. And I don't think it's in the lesson. It's the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Okay, so who is greater? Is the Sabbath greater? A man's greater? It's like I have a watch. I have a watch. A watch, I'm not gonna say it was made for me, but it was purchased for me. So it's my watch. Okay. It benefits me. The watch, I don't revolve around the watch. The watch helped me. The watch was built for me to benefit. And the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So which is greater? Which is greater? It's man's needs, man's mercy on a soul, rather than saying, well, everything revolves around the Sabbath. It revolves around man. And even in the end, and it is in verse 6, for I say unto you that in this place is one greater than the temple. Jesus was greater than the temple. Jesus was greater than the law. In other words, he made the Sabbath. He made the law. Okay? And Jesus is above the law. Okay? Jesus was greater than the law. He had authority over the law. He had authority over even the Sabbath, which was the law. So the Sabbath didn't trump Jesus. The law didn't trump Jesus. Jesus is greater than the law. In other words, what trumps what? Does the law trump Jesus? No. Jesus trumps the law. Jesus was greater than the law. Okay? Jesus is above the law. Now we have some people that say that, well, certain people is above the law. And then they come back and say, nobody's above the law. I mean, okay, we're talking about the secular law. But the law is not above Jesus. The law doesn't trump Jesus. And the Sabbath law was a law. So how does the Sabbath law trump Jesus? Jesus trumped the law. He said in verse 8, he said, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is master. When you master, we have in our society a master-servant relationship. The master trumps the servant. So he said, I'm master of the law. So how does the law trump me? The law don't trump me. I trump the law. I'm greater than the law. I'm greater than the Sabbath. Okay? So so that's the whole thing is the Pharisees and the religious leaders did not have the real interpretation of why, of the purpose of the Sabbath. The purpose of the Sabbath was to benefit man, not man to benefit the Sabbath. Okay. And that's where the conflict arose. And as I said earlier, they misquoted, they misstated what the disciples were allowed to do. And we already read it back in Deuteronomy. We're not going to go back over it. We read it that what the disciples did was allowable. They wasn't harvesting. They didn't take a sickle to it. They was allowed to do that, but the Pharisees interpreted as, yes, you technically violated the Mosaic law, which they did not. Okay, because and again, if you take away anything from this lesson, is that human needs, that is mercy, compassion, trumps the ceremonial laws. Okay, it trumps, and that's what Jesus has always been trying to explain. I mean, there was a purpose for the law, but when it comes to human needs, the human needs would take precedent. They would take priority. And that's all Jesus was trying to relate to them. But again, they didn't want to see it. They didn't want to understand it because they was hostile toward Jesus because they rejected him. Now, if they had accepted him, they would have said, okay, well, thanks for explaining that to us. That we thought that the laws trump human needs. No, you enlighten us. No, they wasn't willing to accept Jesus' explanation because they hated him. They despised him. So they're going to find everything that they can to hold against him, anything they can, and they're going to twist the facts. As I showed you, they did twist the facts because disciples did nothing that was not allowable under the law. And again, the laws were ceremonial. Okay, the laws of ceremony and God's command, and we showed that in where the priest was allowed to do work, where you could tell them out to work, and they blamed us because God commanded. If God commands something, His word is going to trump the ceremonial law, or well, in other words, is that the priest can do what would be construed as work, and they won't be blamed because I command that. I commanded it. I say okay. It's okay because I'm Lord of the Sabbath. I'm Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is not Lord over me. Okay, and that's our lesson. Lord of the Sabbath. So Jesus trumps the Sabbath law, which were a ceremonial law. And secondly, the Pharisees, they added traditions to the law, which were a burden and not a benefit. They put burdens on the people that, as I said, they added rules that were more burdensome. They were more burdensome. And that was the thing that Jesus, the fault that Jesus had with them, because they did not have a proper understanding of the observance of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was to benefit humanity, not to burden humanity. And that's our lesson today. We'd like to thank you for watching. We ask you to join us next week for another edition of the Sunday School Review. Thank you.